The fog whispered that night, thick, wet, alive, curling through alleys like a living thing searching for warmth. Gas lamps burned low behind soot-streaked glass, their yellow eyes barely cutting through the dark. Horse hooves clattered once, then faded, swallowed whole by the mist that smothered every sound. Somewhere along Fleet Street, a door creaked open and shut again, though no footsteps followed. Down by the river, pumpkins floated in the black current, their carved faces twisted into grotesque grins. The smell of smoke clung to the air, not from hearths, but from the coal barges that drifted like shadows beneath the bridge. A violin played from an open window, mournful and slow, before stopping mid-note as if the musician had suddenly remembered he wasn't alone. On Baker Street, a constable swore he saw a woman in white walk straight through a wall. In Spitalfields, a candle burned in a room no one had rented in years. The city felt awake, not alive, but aware, like it was holding its breath beneath the weight of all its secrets. The newspapers would later call it hysteria. The people who lived through it called it something else entirely the night London spoke back. Drawn to the dark tonight? Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Tonight, we're stepping back to 1888, to a Halloween swallowed by fog and fear when the ghosts of London stopped waiting for invitation. The city breathed in smoke that night. Coal, sweat, perfume and rot mingled together in the air until even the stars refused to look down. The gas lamps sputtered and hissed along the empty streets, their light swallowed by the thick grey fog that clung to every brick, every window pane, every forgotten doorstep. It was the kind of night Londoners had come to expect, heavy, damp, endless. But this one was different. Those who lived through it said the fog moved wrong. It rolled not with the wind, but against it, curling down alleyways as though it was searching for something. People spoke of hearing it, a faint hiss beneath the chimneys, a murmur beneath the horse hooves, as if the city itself was trying to whisper through the mist. And if you stood very still, you could almost make out words. It was the 31st of October, 1888. A Saturday. The newspapers that morning had carried the same stories: the murders in Whitechapel, the fear that clung to every shadow, the promise of another cold winter coming. Yet as evening fell, London tried to forget. There were lanterns hung in shop fronts, masks sold by the dozen, laughter echoing from taverns where the beer ran cheap and the stories ran wild. But beyond the laughter, the city was listening. A carriage clattered down Fleet Street just before midnight, its wheels rattling over cobblestones slick with fog. The driver saw shapes in the mist faces maybe, or tricks of light, and urged the horses faster. He didn't notice the shadow that passed behind him, gliding soundlessly until it vanished into the fog. Down by the river, a ferryman moored his boat and lit his pipe. He swore the water rippled in patterns that spelled out names he didn't know but felt like he should. By 1 o'clock, the fog had grown so thick it pressed against the glass of windows, dimming even the brightest lamps. People said it muffled sound, but that wasn't true. It changed sound. Footsteps stretched too long, voices carried too far, and every so often you could hear a whisper just behind your ear, though no one was there. At Street Dimfners, the church bell began to toll slow and uneven, 11, 12, and then one more. Though the clock above the nave was still, the sexton dropped his lantern and ran. He swore the last bell wasn't struck by hand, but by breath. Somewhere near Hyde Park, a group of young men stumbled from a masquerade ball, laughing behind their fox masks. They said the fog parted before them like a curtain, revealing the outline of a woman standing on the path dressed in white, her eyes too dark to reflect the light. When they looked again, she was gone, but one of their masks was missing. In the morning, the fog thinned. The lamps flickered back to their familiar gold. The city looked almost normal again. But along the Thames, a constable found something strange, the prints of bare feet, too small for a man, leading from the water to the steps of Street Dimfners. They stopped at the church door and went no farther. People still talk about that night, the night the fog learned to speak. Some say it was a trick of the mind, a city choking on its own fear. Others believe London wasn't haunted that Halloween, it was alive. And if you stand by the river long enough, when the mist curls low and the bells toll out of time, you might still hear it breathing. The fog hadn't yet lifted when morning came. It hung over the rooftops like a memory that refused to fade, sinking into the cracks between the cobblestones and the folds of every passerby's coat. Londoners went about their Sunday routines, newspapers tucked under arms, boots scraping the wet pavement, pretending not to notice that the air still smelled faintly of smoke and candle wax. But the city was watching. By afternoon, the market stalls along Bishopsgate were alive with chatter. Pumpkins, imported from the countryside, sat in wooden crates beside apples slick with dew. Hawkers shouted their prices, children darted between carts, and the street musicians played the same old tunes, cheerful enough to make you forget what lay beneath the noise. Yet if you listened closely, you could hear it, a hollow echo beneath every laugh, as though the fog had crept into the sound itself. Near the corner of Threadneedle Street, a man sold lanterns shaped like skulls, tin frames painted gold, their mouths cut open for candlelight. They glowed pale and strange through the mist. "Keeps away spirits," he said to every buyer, his grin missing more teeth than it showed. Few noticed that his hands were shaking, or that his own lantern never stayed lit. As dusk returned, London began its quiet transformation. The shopkeepers lit their lamps, the chimneys belched fresh smoke, and the laughter of the living tangled with something softer, a hum that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. At 6 o'clock, the first gaslight went out. Then another still. Entire blocks dimmed to grey. The lamplighters worked double pace, striking matches against iron posts, but the flames sputtered blue before dying again. "Fault in the mains," one muttered. But deep down, everyone knew that gas had nothing to do with it. A boy on Fleet Street claimed he saw a face in the lantern glass, not his own reflection, but someone else's, someone looking back. He threw the lamp into the gutter and ran until his shoes tore open. When a constable later retrieved it, he found the glass still warm, as though someone inside had just breathed against it. By nightfall, the mask sellers had packed their stalls. Only the pumpkins remained, their carved mouths sagging with rot. The last buyer of the evening was a woman in widow's black, her veil drawn low, her gloved hand trembling as she paid for a single, uncarved pumpkin. The vendor asked if she wanted a candle to go with it. "No," she said quietly. "He brings his own light." Later that night, near the corner of Ludgate Hill, the same vendor was found slumped over his cart. His eyes were open, and every lantern he'd sold that day had somehow returned, all 30 of them, glowing softly around him, their lights flickering like small, deliberate breaths. The papers the next morning would call it hysteria, a seasonal delusion, blaming cheap gin and foul air. But the old women along the river whispered a different tale, that London had begun to remember the faces it buried. They said the fog had eyes now, and that each lantern burning blue in the streets was not meant to ward off ghosts, it was meant to keep them in. The river was quieter than usual that night. No ferries, no singing bargemen. Even the rats that nested in the damp wood of the docks kept still, their tiny claws frozen mid-scrape. The Thames, that slow black vein of the city, had turned to glass beneath the fog, so calm it reflected the lamps along the embankment like trapped souls. Those who lived by the water swore the river could talk if you listened long enough. It hummed, it gurgled, it sighed the breathing of something vast and patient. But on that Halloween night, it did not sing or sigh. It spoke. The first to hear it was a dockworker named Owen Red. He'd stayed behind after his mates went home, his boots heavy with silt, his breath turning white in the air. He leaned against a piling and listened to the water lick the stones. Then, faint as the scrape of a quill, he heard a whisper. Not words exactly, more like the shape of them. He knelt down, one hand on the slick wood. The voice came again, clearer now. It said his name. The others found him at dawn, eyes open, mouth full of river water, lantern still burning beside him. They said he looked as though he'd been listening even in death. Farther downstream, the ferrymen refused to cross. One claimed he'd seen candles drifting against the current, moving upriver toward the city instead of out to sea. Another swore a pale hand had reached from the water to pull at his oar. They tied their boats and left them bobbing empty, the ropes creaking like tired bones. By midnight, the fog had thickened until it seemed to rise directly out of the river's throat. It slithered between arches of the bridges and climbed the embankments like smoke from an unseen fire. Those who lingered near the water's edge said it carried voices, not echoes, but confessions, snatches of apologies, prayers, and laughter too raw to belong to the living. At Blackfriars Bridge, a woman in a white shawl leaned over the parapet, her breath fogging the stone. "He's still down there," she whispered to no one in particular. "He won't stop calling me." When constables arrived later, she was gone, but her shawl remained dry, untouched by the mist, as though she had stepped out of the world entirely. Across the river in Lambeth, an old fisherman swore he saw the lights of a sunken ship moving beneath the surface, its lanterns swaying like underwater stars. He crossed himself and turned away, but not before one of the lights blinked 3 times, like a signal. The next morning, his boat drifted ashore without him. The oars were still set, and a single gold coin sat on the seat, stamped with a date 50 years too old. By dawn, the fog began to pull back, retreating toward the banks like a living tide. The first rays of pale sun touched the water, and for a brief moment the Thames gleamed silver, serene, almost holy. But when the light reached the center, the surface shivered once, twice, as if something beneath had exhaled. That day, no one fetched water from the river. No one washed, no one crossed the bridges alone. Because everyone in London now understood what they'd heard whispered through the mist. The Thames had spoken, and it had learned their names. The bankers had all gone home by dusk, leaving Threadneedle Street silent but for the echo of boots on wet cobblestone. The fog rolled thick between the columns of the Bank of England, curling around the lion statues and dripping from the iron gates. Lamps hummed in the mist, glowing dull gold like eyes half shut in sleep. But one building along that street had no light at all. Its shutters were drawn, its knocker rusted black, and still people swore they saw a glow inside. Number 93 had been abandoned for 40 years. The plague had taken the family who lived there, a merchant, his wife, their 3 sons, though no record remained of their burial. The neighbors claimed the house had been sealed by order of the city, but no one could recall when. Only the oldest lamplighter, a man with cataracts like pearls, remembered seeing a woman in grey at the upstairs window every October, her face turned toward the street. On the Halloween of 1888, the fog settled thick as wool, the street lamps guttered low, and as midnight neared, the door of number 93 unlatched with a slow groan. A clerk named Henry Dobbs, hurrying home from his post at the exchange, heard the sound. He turned to see the door hanging open, just wide enough to show a line of warm light spilling across the steps. A woman's voice drifted out, humming, low and sweet, like a lullaby from another room. "Miss," he called, "you all right in there?" The humming stopped. Then came the sound of something dragging, slow, deliberate, heavy. Henry took a step back. The fog behind him thickened until he could no longer see the lamps. He turned to run, but the street had changed. The paving stones rippled beneath his boots, soft as mud. The light from the doorway grew brighter, stretching toward him like an open hand. When he finally broke into a sprint, the sound followed him, not footsteps, but a soft scraping, like fingernails across plaster. He reached Cornhill and didn't stop until he was inside a constable's station, gasping out the story. The officer on duty humoured him, as they often did with nervous clerks and gin-drunk labourers. But when they returned to Threadneedle Street, the door of number 93 was closed again, locked tight. Inside the station later, Henry swore he could still hear that song, He stuffed his ears with cotton and refused to leave until morning. By sunrise, he was gone, vanished from his cot, his coat and shoes neatly folded by the door. When the constables went to search the house once more, they found the door ajar again. This time, they went in. The air was thick with dust, the floorboards warped, the wallpaper peeling in long grey strips. Upstairs, the master bedroom was empty but for a rocking chair facing the window. It moved gently, though the air was still. On the nightstand sat a candle burned halfway down wax, dripping into a cracked teacup, and beside it a framed photograph, a man, his wife, and 3 young boys. The back read in faded ink, "The Dobbs family, 1848. No one has lived on Threadneedle Street since. But each year, when the fog returns, a faint golden light can be seen in that upper window, and a voice, soft as breath, hums the same lullaby through the cracks. The fog had teeth that week, small and sharp, the kind that bit through wool coats and lace collars alike. It drifted through the East End, devouring the moonlight, settling heavy against the panes of a narrow brick building on Hanbury Street. Behind its second-floor window sat a woman who hadn't been seen in years. The neighbors called her the seamstress. No one knew her name anymore. Some said she'd died during the cholera outbreak of '66, others that she'd been evicted long ago. But each Halloween, without fail, the same candle burned behind that window, and the shadow of a woman could be seen bent over her sewing table, needle flashing in steady rhythm. On the evening of October 31st, 1888, a boy named Thomas Briggs dared his mates to knock on her door. "Bet she'll give you a sweet if you're polite," he joked, puffing out his chest. They gathered at the bottom of the narrow stairwell, the air thick with soot and the scent of boiled cabbage from the lodgings below. When no one else stepped forward, Thomas climbed the stairs alone. He knocked 3 times. The door opened on its own. The room inside smelled of lavender and starch. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, though they were covered in a fine film of dust. A single candle burned beside a half-finished dress on the mannequin white satin, trimmed in tiny glass beads that glittered like frost. "Mrs.?" Thomas whispered. "You dropped your key?" A soft voice answered from the corner. "Mind the thread, dear. It tangles easy." He turned. A woman sat in the sewing chair, her back to him, shoulders rising and falling with every careful stitch. Her dress was grey, her hair pinned neat beneath a bonnet. "You shouldn't sew this late," the boy said, trying to sound brave. "Bad for the eyes." The needle paused mid-air. "Oh, I don't sew for myself," she said gently. "I sew to remember." The candle guttered once, twice, then flared bright. In that instant, Thomas saw her reflection in the window, a face pale as paper, hollow where the eyes should have been. The dress in her lap shimmered faintly, as though catching light from some place far beyond the room. He bolted. Down the stairs, through the fog, tripping over cobblestones until his lungs burned. When he finally looked back, the candle had gone out. Only the faint outline of her figure remained in the window, frozen mid-stitch. The next morning, the landlord went to inspect the flat. He found it empty, no fabric, no chair, no trace of a tenant. Only a single spool of white thread lay on the sill, unspooled and leading out through the open window, disappearing into the fog. That night, every seamstress on Hanbury Street reported the same thing: needles rusting overnight, spools of thread unraveling in silence, as if some unseen hand still worked through them. And each year since, when the autumn mist presses against the glass, people claim to see her, a figure bent over a phantom dress, stitching patiently by candlelight. They say she's still waiting to finish the gown she began before death interrupted her work. And if you watch too long, you might feel the tug of thread at your sleeve, her way of asking you to stay. By dawn, the fog had crawled over the city like a living shroud. It dripped from the eaves, pooled in gutters, and crept between the pages of the morning papers stacked outside the presses. Fleet Street, the proud artery of London's voice, woke to silence. The printing presses that usually roared through the night now thudded slow and uneven, as if the machines themselves were afraid to speak. Inside the London Herald, the air was thick with ink and coal dust. Typesetters moved in shadows, their fingers blackened to the bone, pressing letters into damp paper that refused to dry. "She's breathing wrong again," one muttered, tapping the great steam press, as if soothing a restless animal. The engine hissed, then groaned, the sound echoing like a sigh through the empty corridors. At 6:30, the editor arrived, Mr. George Wickham, a man who'd spent 30 years turning rumour into truth for profit. He found the night shift pale and silent, staring at a stack of freshly printed sheets. When he picked one up, the headline chilled him to the marrow. 5 dead in Fleet Street fire, victims found before dawn. The date beneath it was correct, the location was correct, but the fire had not yet happened. He crumpled the page and barked for the machines to stop. The pressman hesitated. "Sir, it's not us," he whispered. "It's printing on its own." And it was. The press arms rose and fell, stamping each sheet with the same dreadful headline, even as the gas lamps flickered blue and the room grew colder. The words bled darker than any ink they'd ever used, so dark it seemed to shimmer when the light hit it. By 7 o'clock, the front office filled with the smell of smoke. Wickham thought one of the machines had overheated, but when he opened the back door to the alley, the air outside was perfectly still. No flames, no heat, only fog-thick, yellow-grey, curling like breath against the brick. "Get out!" he shouted, but no one moved. Because at that moment, the press began to print again. The same headline, the same story, only now the victims' names appeared beneath it, one by one. Every man in the room watched as his own name emerged from the ink. The first scream echoed through the stairwell, the second never finished. When constables arrived hours later, the building stood cold and unburned, the presses still, the paper stacks untouched except for a thin smear of soot along the floor. Only 5 men were missing. That evening, a lamplighter passing through the alley swore he saw firelight flicker behind the Herald's windows, orange and fierce, dancing against the fog. But when he stepped closer, the glow vanished, replaced by the faint rhythm of the press, thudding once, twice, then stopping. The next morning's edition carried no headline at all, only a single line, printed in smaller type at the bottom of the page. "The fog has learned to write." Since that day, no paper in London dares to print on Halloween Eve, because Fleet Street remembers. And so does the fog. At the edge of Holborn, hemmed between warehouses and tenements, stood the church of Street Dimphna, a narrow, soot-stained chapel with a spire that leaned slightly east, as though bowing to the smog. Most days, no one noticed it. The bells hadn't rung in years, not since the parish ran out of funds to pay a proper sexton. But on the last night of October 1888, they rang, and they did not stop. The first toll came at midnight, sharp and heavy, a sound that cut through the fog like a blade. The second followed close behind. By the third, the rats were spilling out of the crypts. By the 6th, the nearby windows rattled in their frames. And by the 12th, every soul awake in Holborn knew something was wrong, because the clock above the nave only went to 12. The 13th toll hung in the air like a held breath, long, drawn, low. Then silence. Father Mallory, the last clergyman still tending to Street Dimphna, woke in his quarters behind the altar. He was a gentle man with shaking hands and weak eyes, half retired, half forgotten. Pulling on his cassock, he lit a lantern and stepped into the nave. The fog had followed him inside. It lay coiled along the floorboards, pale and restless. The bells tolled once more, only this time they weren't coming from the steeple, they were coming from below. He made his way down into the crypts, each step echoing in the damp air. Water dripped from the stone ceiling. The smell of iron and mildew hung thick. The deeper he went, the louder the sound grew, not a proper bell tone anymore, but something softer, hollow, like breath caught in metal. At the bottom of the stairs, his lantern dimmed. He raised it, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a figure among the tombs, hunched and glimmering pale in the half-light. "Who's there?" No answer, only the sound of breathing, steady and deliberate. Then he saw it, the church's great bell, the one that had been removed years ago after the tower cracked. It stood upright on the floor of the crypt, black with soot, too heavy to have moved. But it was swaying, slowly, as though stirred by invisible hands. Mallory whispered a prayer. The bell stopped. He stepped closer, and that was when he heard it. Voices, not echoes, not wind, voices inside the bell. Men, women, children murmuring prayers in perfect unison. His lantern sputtered and died, but the glow from within the bell remained, faint and red, pulsing with each breath. The sexton found him at dawn, lying beside the bell with his hand pressed against the metal, his face turned upward in peace or rapture. He was still warm. By the time help arrived, the glow had vanished, and the bell was silent once again. But on the next night and every Halloween since the sound returns, first 12 tolls for the hours, then one more, softer than the rest. And those who stand close enough to hear it say, it isn't a chime at all, it's a whisper. 100 voices speaking together from the dark, saying the same 3 words. We are here, beneath the eternal haze of Whitechapel, where the streets never quite lost the smell of blood and smoke, stood a narrow building marked only by a tarnished brass sign, Mr. Edwin Harrow, undertaker and supplier of mourning goods. The windows were blacked with age, the curtains never drawn. Even in daylight, the place felt buried. Mr. Harrow had served the dead for 40 years, quietly, efficiently, without question. He was a man of habit, breakfast at 6, polishing caskets by 8, taking orders from the hospital by noon. He'd seen more corpses than most priests saw sinners. Yet, for all that, he'd never feared them. The dead, he often said, were predictable. It was the living who tended to misbehave. But on the night of October 31st, 1888, that rule changed. The fog came earlier than usual, thick as wool, crawling beneath the door and clinging to the furniture. Harrow sat at his workbench, shaping the final details of a pine coffin meant for a man who'd drowned in the Thames. As he worked, his lantern flickered low, and he noticed something strange. The glass had fogged from the inside. He wiped it clean, muttering to himself, and kept carving, but when he glanced again, a print had formed in the condensation, small, narrow, the shape of a hand pressing out from within. He froze. Then, slowly, the flame in the lantern brightened. It stretched upward like a reaching finger. Outside, a carriage rolled past, wheels muffled by fog. The horse's breath plumed white in the dark, and the driver, an old friend of Harrow's, glanced at the shop window. Later, he would swear he saw someone standing inside beside the undertaker, a tall, pale man in a black suit, holding a lantern of his own. Harrow worked until midnight. At last, he lifted his lantern and crossed to the basement, where the finished coffins waited in rows. The air down there was colder, the wood creaking softly as if it too were breathing. He placed the lantern on a hook, adjusted his spectacles, and began to sweep the dust from the floorboards. And then the faint sound of tapping. He stopped, listened. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks. Muffled, deliberate. It came from the coffin nearest the stairs. He leaned closer. The sound stopped. His pulse thudded in his ears. Then, from the dark, a whisper. Not yet. The lantern flared white. Every coffin lid rattled in its place. The broom fell from his hand as the tapping spread dozens of small, frantic knocks from inside every box. The room glowed brighter and brighter until the light burned blue, then died all at once. The next morning, neighbors found the door of Harrow's shop wide open, the fog still heavy inside. The undertaker's lantern lay shattered on the floor, its wick blackened to ash. Of Mr. Harrow, there was no sign, only his coat and spectacles neatly folded on the workbench, and a single coffin in the center of the room with a fresh name carved into it, Edwin Harrow. 1888. Each Halloween since, the fog gathers first on that street, the shutters tremble, and sometimes a faint glow appears behind the window, a single lantern burning in the dark, carried by no one. Locals say it's Harrow making his rounds, that the dead have no one else they trust. It began, as many London hauntings did, with footsteps no one wanted to claim. Just past dusk, on November 1st, 1888, the sound came again, the steady tap of a cane, the soft drag of skirts through the wet fog of Spitalfields Market. Stall holders were packing up, sweeping away wilted flowers and bruised apples. The gas lamps burned low, halos trembling in the mist. And through that wavering light, the widow appeared. She was first seen by a watchman who'd lingered near the empty stalls. He swore he saw her glide between the iron pillars, tall, thin, wrapped in black crape from neck to heel. Her veil hid everything but her mouth, and even that seemed wrong. Too pale, too still. She carried no basket, no umbrella, only a single white rose pressed tight in her gloved hand. When he called to her, she turned. Slowly. "Are you lost, ma'am?" Her voice, when it came, was faint, not carried by air, but through it, like sound underwater. "No," she said, "I'm waiting." "For who?" he asked. She didn't answer. She simply pointed to the fog, where the outline of a man seemed to be taking shape, a dark figure moving toward her, slow and uneven, as if climbing up from somewhere far below. The watchman blinked, and both were gone. Only the rose remained, floating in a puddle, untouched by rain. By morning, word had spread through the alleys. The widow had returned. For years, she'd been a story whispered among costermongers, a bride whose husband had drowned in the Thames before their wedding day. They said she'd refused to remove her veil, even in death, buried in her black gown, her fingers still clutching a bouquet of river lilies. That evening, a young constable named Alfred Preece volunteered to patrol the market, eager to prove the superstition false. He carried a lantern and a pistol, though the fog made both nearly useless. Around midnight, he reached the corner of Dorset Street and froze. There she was again, the widow, standing beneath a lamp that flickered weakly against the mist. He raised his lantern. "Madam," he said, forcing his voice steady, "you shouldn't be out so late." She lifted her head. Through the veil, two eyes glimmered, not reflecting the light, but giving it a cold silver glow that dimmed everything around her. "Do you mourn them too?" she asked. He took a step back. "Mourn who?" "The ones who never came home." Her voice was softer now, the edges fraying like silk. "The river keeps them, but it never stops sending me back." The lamp above them shattered. The fog swallowed the sound. When dawn came, the constable's lantern was found burning on the ground, its glass cracked from within. His boots were discovered neatly side by the water's edge, and beside them a veil dripping with river silt. In the weeks that followed, the widow was seen again, always near bridges, always with a white rose in hand. Those who caught her reflection in shop windows said her face was beautiful until she smiled. Then the veil fluttered, though there was no wind, and the candlelight dimmed for miles. Every year since, when the fog rolls in heavy from the Thames, florists find roses missing from their stalls. And in the grey silence of Spitalfields, a single figure drifts through the mist-veiled, patient, waiting still. By the final night of October, 1888, London's lamps burned strange. The fog was heavier than ever, thick enough to muffle hoofbeats and swallow entire streets whole. Even seasoned lamplighters, men who prided themselves on walking the city blindfolded, lost their bearings in it. The glow of the gaslights, usually golden and soft, had begun to shift. One by one, across the city, they flickered from amber to blue. It started near Blackfriars Bridge, just past midnight. A boy named Sam Harker was making his rounds, lighting the final row of lamps along the embankment. He worked fast, swinging his long pole, tapping the glass chimneys, whistling to keep away the silence. But halfway through his route, the flame in his lighter sputtered, then burned bright turquoise. He frowned, shook it, tried again. The next lamp flared to life with the same eerie hue, casting a cold, watery light across the fog. Within minutes, the whole street was bathed in that unnatural glow. The boy could see his breath shimmering blue before him. The river below looked frozen solid. He felt something shift in the air, a faint vibration, like the hum of a distant organ. He turned to leave. But the lamps on either side of him flickered in sequence, one after another, as if following his steps. Each hissed louder, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He dropped his lighter and ran, the fog parting just long enough for him to see the outlines of shapes moving inside, the light, faint silhouettes, like figures trapped within the glass. By morning, Sam was found wandering near Ludgate Hill, eyes glassy, hands burned, though he'd carried no fire. He could only mumble one thing to the constable who found him. They weren't lamps, they were eyes. The phenomenon spread. By nightfall, the entire district from the Strand to Whitechapel flickered with that same icy hue. The fog reflected it until the whole city seemed to glow like a drowned world. People peered through their curtains and swore the light was moving, bending, reshaping itself into faces that pressed against the glass before vanishing. One cab driver refused to work that night, claiming the gaslights followed his carriage, dimming when he turned, brightening when he stopped. Another woman, on Bishopsgate, said she saw her late husband's face reflected in the flame outside her home, smiling faintly, mouthing her name. At 3 a.m, every lamp in London flared at once. For a single heartbeat, the fog burned white, so bright it threw shadows on the clouds. Then, silence. The light died. Every street went black. When the city awoke, the lamps were cold and dry, their mantles unbroken, but the engineers who inspected them found something strange. Faint fingerprints smudged inside the glass, some too small to be human. For weeks afterward, gaslight workers complained that their torches hissed when unlit, whispering words they couldn't quite make out. Some refused to work past dusk altogether. And to this day, when the London fog thickens to the colour of smoke and the lamps turn pale and cold, the old-timers in Holborn still cross themselves. They say the light remembers that once, on one Halloween long ago, the dead found a way to see again and chose the gaslight for their eyes. The fog had grown thick enough to hide the gas lamps completely. The kind of night where even sound got lost, footsteps fading too soon, voices echoing too long. Constable Harold Kemp buttoned his coat to the throat and tugged his cap lower as he walked his beat along Bishopsgate. The air stank of coal smoke and river damp, and each exhale came out like a ghost. He'd walked this route for years, knew every alley, every brick chipped by carriage wheels, but that night, London felt different. The silence pressed against him. Even the usual drunks had vanished into doorways. He could hear the city breathing, slow and heavy, beneath the fog. At 12:14 by his pocket watch, Kemp heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not urgent, more like someone leaning close to share a secret. He stopped, turned. Nothing. The street behind him was empty, except for a single lamp flickering blue in the mist. He took a few more steps, boots echoing soft on the stones. Then again the whisper. Closer this time. Harold. He froze. His heart stuttered once, hard enough to make his throat ache. Nobody called him by name on duty, not at that hour, not on that street. He turned toward the sound. The fog shifted, shapes forming and dissolving in the lamplight. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. "Show yourself." No answer, only that low, dragging sound like a coat hem brushing cobblestone. He raised his truncheon, more for comfort than defense, and advanced toward the corner. "Harold," the whisper came again, softer now, closer still. "Don't leave me." He swung his lantern up, the light fell across the wall, and there, in the sheen of damp brick, was a reflection that wasn't his. A woman's face, pale and blurred as frost on glass, her lips moving in time with the voice. Her eyes were dark and bottomless, and even as the flame in his lantern wavered, he could see her smiling. Kemp stumbled back. The whisper grew louder, splitting into 2, then 4, then dozens, all calling his name. The fog around him thickened, swirling like hands reaching out from the air itself. He bolted, running blind, his lantern swinging wildly, its light carving brief tunnels through the grey. He didn't stop until he reached the steps of St. Dymphna's church. There, panting and trembling, he turned and saw the fog part down the length of the street, like a curtain being drawn. Something stood at the far end, a shape tall and thin, watching him. Then it faded, leaving only the sound of bells far off in the mist. When morning came, the constable's whistle was found lying in the middle of Bishopsgate, still wet with condensation. A few hours later, they found his lantern empty, its wick burned out, its glass clouded on the inside as though something had breathed against it. Kemp himself was never seen again. That winter, new officers assigned to Bishopsgate reported a strange occurrence. Every night, at exactly 12:14, a faint whistle echoes once through the fog, followed by a man's voice, barely more than breath, saying the same thing over and over. "Don't leave me." And if you stand too long to listen, the fog gets thicker. Long before dawn, when most of London slept, the rag and bone men began their work, trawling the alleys for scraps of iron, bottles, bones, and dreams no one wanted anymore. They moved like ghosts through the fog, calling out their familiar cry, rags, bones, any old iron, a song the city had learned to ignore. But there was one man who never needed to shout. Elias Morrow. Thin as wire, eyes too bright for his age, he worked the narrow lanes around Whitechapel, dragging a handcart held together with rope and prayer. People whispered that Elias could find anything, a lost locket, a missing ring, even a photograph torn to shreds. He said the fog helped him, that it whispered where to look. No one believed him. Not until Halloween of 1888. That night, the city was drowning in mist so thick it turned every lamp into a blur. Elias wandered the alleys near Petticoat Lane, his lantern swinging low, its light catching glints of metal among the cobblestones. He found an old shoe, a cracked teacup, a handful of nails. Then, at the corner of Gun Street, something gold caught his eye, a wedding band half buried in the mud. He picked it up and felt the metal pulse, warm against his skin. He rubbed it clean with his sleeve and read the inscription inside, "Forever, M&E, 1848. When he looked up, the fog had changed. It swirled tighter around him, pressing close, humming softly like breath through a keyhole. A woman's voice rose from somewhere near his cart. "Thank you," it said. Elias froze. The lantern light trembled. "Who's there?" No answer. But the air grew colder, heavy with the smell of river silt and candle wax. Then something moved inside the cart, the pile of bones and bottles shifting on its own. He leaned closer. A ringed hand reached out from beneath the rags, pale, water-slicked, impossibly real. He stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly, throwing light across the walls. For a heartbeat, he saw her, a woman in a soaped wedding dress, her veil tangled with weeds, eyes wide and shining with gratitude or hunger. "Forever," she whispered. Elias bolted into the fog, leaving the cart behind. When the sun rose, the cart still sat there, but all the bones were gone. Only the gold ring remained, placed neatly on the handle, as if returned. They found Elias 3 days later wandering barefoot along the riverbank, muttering to himself. He would not speak of what happened except to say, "She followed the sound of her name." The doctors at Bethlehem tried to make sense of his ramblings, but at night he would rise from his cot and whisper to the air, "Not all bones rest easy." After his death, the other rag and bone men began to find strange things in their loads: silver brooches, hairpins, bits of jewelry that gleamed with river damp. None claimed them, none sold them. They buried them at the edges of the city instead, whispering thanks to the fog before walking away. And even now, when the streets grow silent before dawn and the mist curls low around the gutters, you can sometimes hear a faint rattle of wheels and the soft murmur of a man's voice calling through the dark. Rags, bones, any old iron. Only now, it's the dead who answer. The lamps in Whitechapel burned low that night, their blue flames trembling against the fog like the pulse of a dying heart. Inside St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Dr. Silas Finch prepared for his final dissection of the evening. The morgue smelled of salt and coal gas, the air thick with formaldehyde and secrets. Dr. Finch was not a cruel man, merely a curious one, and in Victorian London, curiosity could be its own form of blasphemy. He'd spent years studying what others feared, the precise moment when life ended and whatever came next began. He believed the body was a door, and that death was not the closing of it, but the turning of a key. On October 31st, 1888, he found that key. The cadaver on his table was a man of 40, drowned in the Thames, lungs full of silt. The tag at his toe read John Doe, unclaimed. Finch adjusted his spectacles, picked up his scalpel, and began to work. As he opened the chest, he noted something unusual, a faint sound beneath the blade, not the echo of a heartbeat, but a whisper. He paused. The morgue was still. Only the lantern flickered. Then it came again, clearer this time, a wet rasp that seemed to form a word. Stop. He dropped the scalpel. It clattered against the tiles. Is someone there? He whispered. The cadaver's mouth opened. No breath escaped, no sound, only a slow exhale of fog, pale and cold, curling upward to meet the light. It thickened, coalescing into the vague shape of a man, the drowned man, perhaps, or what was left of him. The spectre leaned forward, its hollow eyes fixed on the doctor. You opened the door, it said. Dr. Finch stumbled back, knocking over a tray of instruments. This isn't possible. Then why do you hear me? The fog rolled across the table, wrapping around his hands like ice water. He felt his pulse falter. I only meant to learn, he whispered. To see. The voice came again, softer, closer. Then look. The lantern flared white. Finch saw the walls melt away, the ceiling dissolve into endless dark. He stood at the center of a great hall, lined with tables like his own, each bearing a body, hundreds, maybe thousands, and every one of them was whispering. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it did no good. The voices seeped through his skin, filling his chest, his bones, until he could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and theirs began. When the attendants found him the next morning, Dr. Finch was standing motionless beside the table, staring at the open body. His scalpel lay at his feet. The corpse's chest was still open, but inside, where there should have been organs, there was nothing but mist. Finch was taken away to an asylum. He never spoke again, except for one phrase he repeated until his final breath. They are not dead, only hollow. St. Bartholomew's never used that room again. They bricked up the door and sealed the records. But sometimes, in the hospital's oldest wing, when the gaslights flicker and the air grows heavy, the nurses claim to hear a faint humming from behind the wall, like a chorus breathing in unison, waiting to be seen. Fog clung to the Thames like silk that night, swallowing the arches of Blackfriars Bridge, until only the gaslights remained faint halos trembling above the water. The hour was late, too late for lovers, too early for lamplighters. Only the river moved, slow and black, its surface rippling like something alive beneath it. They said the bridge whispered before dawn that if you stood alone and listened carefully, you could hear it call your name. Most dismissed it as a trick of wind through the stonework. But in 1888, on All Hallows' Eve, those whispers grew louder. It began with a pair of sweethearts walking home from the theatre. A clerk named William Brant and his fiancée, Clara Shaw. They stopped midway across the bridge to watch the fog roll in arm, her parasol glinting faintly in the lamplight. Clara leaned over the balustrade, peering into the murk. Will, she said softly. It's talking. He laughed. The river's just the river, love. No. Her voice trembled. Listen. And he did. Beneath the slow churn of the current, there was another sound, a low murmur, rhythmic, like hundreds of voices rising through water. He couldn't make out the words, only the cadence. It almost sounded inviting. Then something strange happened. The fog below began to glow faintly at first, then brighter, shifting in colors that didn't belong to fire or gaslight. Faces seemed to form in it, pale, blurred, mouths moving as if singing. Clara stepped closer, her hand reaching toward the water. Clara, stop. They know my name, she whispered. And then she was gone. The police later reported no splash, no scream, no sign of struggle. It was as if she'd simply been taken by the mist. William came back the next night, convinced she was still there. He stood where she'd vanished, lantern in hand, whispering her name over and over until the fog closed around him too. The constables found his hat and his light on the bridge, both dry, both still warm. After that, the stories multiplied. A vagrant swore he saw dozens of figures standing on the parapet at once, their mouths moving in silence. A milkman claimed he heard his mother humming beneath his cartwheels, though she'd been dead 3 years. Fishermen refused to dock anywhere near Blackfriars, saying the water there breathed funny and pulled their lines taut, as if hooked to something below. By winter, the whispers had grown bolder. They began to mimic repeating words spoken by those who crossed after midnight. A solicitor returning from chambers heard his own voice echo back to him, though his lips were still. When he reached the far side, he was weeping, unable to say why. The city council ordered repairs on the bridge that spring. The masons found nothing wrong with the stone except, deep in one of the arches, a hollow cavity filled with air that hissed faintly even when sealed. To this day, Londoners hurry their pace when the fog thickens along Blackfriars. The gaslights flicker blue, the river hums beneath the arches, and if you stop too long to listen, the whispers will find you. They'll start by saying your name, gently, kindly. Then they'll ask you to lean closer. And if you do, you'll never hear the water again. By the turn of the hour, the fog had reached Covent Garden, wrapping itself around the awnings, dulling the glint of knives and dampening the smell of blood that never truly left the stones. Butchers' stalls sat shuttered in silence, save for one faint glow from the back of a narrow shop on Henrietta Street. Inside, old Thomas Wren, the butcher, was still awake. He had been carving since morning, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the scent of salt and brine clinging to his skin. On the counter before him lay a small wooden mask, half-finished, crudely shaped, its surface polished with care. It was meant for his daughter, Eliza. She'd begged him for it all week. A proper mask, father for the masquerade. She was his only child, 17, clever, kind, and full of the restless laughter that the city tried to crush from its poor. But tonight, the laughter had gone. Eliza had not come home. The ball at the theatre had ended before midnight. Crowds poured out into the fog, their laughter swallowed by the streets. Thomas had waited at the door, lantern burning low, long after the bells had struck one. At last, he went searching. He found the mask first. It hung nailed to his door the next morning. Eliza's mask, the one she'd promised to wear, its ribbons still tied neat, as though someone had placed it there with care. But the wood was stained dark along the edges. When he pulled it down, he saw the carving on the back, a single word burned into the grain: mine. The constables searched the district, finding no sign of her. Neighbours whispered of a carriage seen near the theatre, black as pitch, drawn by horses without sound. Others spoke of a man in a plague doctor's mask, offering roses to young women as they left the ball. Days turned into weeks. The butcher's shop stayed closed, the meat on the hooks spoiled, the knives rusted in their blocks. Only the sound of his whetstone could still be heard through the shuttered door, the slow, steady rhythm of a blade being honed too sharp for mortal use. Then, one fog-soaked morning, Thomas reopened. He was calm, smiling even. He sold cuts of beef, of mutton, of something that smelled faintly sweet and wrong. No one asked questions. By evening, his shop was dark again. The constables broke in the next day. Inside, they found no body, no blood, no butcher. Only the mask Eliza's sitting on the counter beside a single knife, its blade clean but still warm. The wall above the counter bore faint scratches, carved deep into the plaster as though made by shaking hands. She came home. After that night, no one rented the shop. But each Halloween, passers-by claimed to see two figures through the window, a young woman in a white gown and a man in a blood-stained apron, dancing slow in the fog while faint music drifts from nowhere. When the gaslight hits just right, the girl's face gleams wooden, carved and smiling, her eyes hollow as candle flames. They say the butcher finally got his wish. His daughter returned to him, polished and perfect, never aging, never leaving. And every year, he sharpens his knife again. The fog that night was not a blanket, but a tide rolling slow, swallowing the lamps one by one, until Hyde Park became a grey sea with no shore. The trees stood like ghosts in mourning, their branches dripping, their roots veiled in mist. Even the ducks had vanished from the Serpentine. At the park's edge, near the Marble Arch, a watchman named Albert Grieve made his rounds with a lantern that gave more comfort than light. The path was slick, the air so still that his own breathing felt intrusive. He'd patrolled the park for 15 years, seen drunks, thieves, lovers, and worse. But that Halloween, the air had a weight to it as though the fog itself were listening. At midnight, he noticed it, a second shadow. It wasn't much at first, just the faint outline beside his own, wavering faintly on the gravel path. He paused, turned his lantern. The fog shifted, but the shape did not. It moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, yet it was taller, thinner, slightly delayed. He whispered a curse under his breath and picked up his pace. The shadow followed. By the lake, the fog thickened into something almost solid. Albert could no longer see the water, but he could hear it, the faint lapping of waves, though there was no wind to make them. The air grew colder with each step, his breath coming out in quick white bursts. When he raised his lantern, he saw movement across the path, a pale shape slipping between the trees. "Who's there?" he barked. No answer, only the sound of wet gravel beneath unseen feet. Then the fog parted just enough for him to see her, a woman, tall and slender, wearing a long dress that trailed along the ground. Her hair gleamed silver in the lamplight. She didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. Her shadow stretched across the path to meet his. He stumbled back, raising the lantern higher. The light flickered, flared, and died. In the dark, the sound of water filled his ears, close now, rushing, as though the Serpentine had risen to meet him. When the park guards found him at dawn, he was standing ankle-deep at the water's edge, his lantern still in hand. His eyes were open, glassy, fixed on the horizon. His own shadow, cast faintly in the early light, leaned in the wrong direction, pointing not toward the sun, but toward the lake. The coroner called it exhaustion. The guards called it madness. But the other watchman whispered of her the figure said to wander Hyde Park when the fog rolls thick and the moon hides her face. They say she's the ghost of a woman who drowned herself in the Serpentine for love, though others claim she was something older, a spirit bound to the mist itself. Whoever she was, she still walks there, reflected only in the eyes of those who see her. And if you cross Hyde Park in the fog, you may notice it too, your shadow stretching longer than it should, even when the lamps behind you are still. Do not turn around, do not speak, just keep walking, because once she steps into your shadow, she never quite leaves. The fog rolled in before the guests arrived, curling against the windows of a narrow townhouse off Bloomsbury Square. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume and candle smoke. A dozen chairs circled a polished mahogany table, each place set with a single glass, a folded handkerchief, and the nervous silence of people who wanted very much to believe. At the head of the table sat Madame Rosalie van London's most infamous medium. Her advertisements filled the back pages of the penny papers. communion with the beyond, reasonable rates, discretion assured. To skeptics, she was a fraud. To the grieving, she was the only voice that could still reach the dead. Halloween night was her busiest. The first knock came at 8. Gentlemen in black coats, ladies wrapped in silk and superstition. They whispered of lost husbands, drowned sons, unanswered prayers. Rosalie greeted each one with a smile too calm for comfort. "Tonight," she said, "the veil is thinnest, but remember, when they answer, you must not interrupt." When the clock struck 9, the séance began. The candles flickered low. Rosalie took the guests' hands, her rings gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Spirits of the departed," she murmured, "we invite you across the threshold of fog and flame. Come gently, come willing, come now." At first, nothing, only the scrape of the fire and the slow drip of rain against the window. Then, one by one, the glasses began to move. Not quickly, not showy, just a slow, deliberate slide toward the center of the table. A woman gasped. "That's my Henry," she whispered. "He always knocks twice." Rosalie's eyes fluttered shut. "Yes," she breathed, "he is near." But as her voice deepened, something changed. The air grew cold, the flame bent sideways, the table creaked as though something heavy leaned on it from below. And when Rosalie spoke again, it was not in her own voice. "Not Henry," the thing said, "not for you." Every glass shattered at once. The candles went out. In the dark, the guests heard the medium laughing low, hoarse, wrong. "You asked for them," she said, her tone slurred, too deep to be human. "But they came for me." Someone struck a match. For an instant, the room flashed orange. Rosalie's chair was empty. The handkerchiefs on the table were soaked through, though with what, no one could tell. By morning, the house was locked tight, every curtain drawn. When police forced the door, they found the table overturned, chairs scattered, soot streaking the ceiling in long black handprints. Of Madame Rosalie, there was no sign except for a smear of candle wax on the wall, shaped like a human face. A week later, the advertisements stopped, but people still gathered at her house every All Hallows Eve, leaving white lilies on the steps. They said if you stood outside at the hour she vanished, you could hear the séance begin again, the shuffle of chairs, the rustle of silk, the soft clink of glass on wood. And if you listened closer, beneath the thunder and the wind, you'd hear her voice not calling the dead anymore, but begging them to let her go. The fog that November morning was so thick it looked alive, coiling through the alleyways behind Fleet Street like steam from a boiling kettle. The printers hadn't slept in 2 nights, the presses roaring, the paper stacked high. It was election season, and London demanded its daily truth, or at least the version that sold. The Morning Register was first to break the story. Its editor, Arthur Llewellyn, was a rational man proud of his skepticism, quick to scoff at talk of spirits. He trusted only 2 things, ink and fact. But on the night of October 31st, 1888, those 2 things betrayed him. He arrived at the office close to midnight, coat slick with fog, hat dripping. The gas lamps hissed, casting long shadows through the rows of idle typewriters. The last printer on duty, a boy no older than 15, greeted him with a tremor in his voice. "Sir," he whispered, "someone's already been here." "Impossible," Llewellyn replied. "I locked the doors myself." But on his desk lay a single sheet of newsprint, damp and still smelling of fresh ink. The headline read, "Tragedy on Fleet Street. Editor found dead at his desk." And beneath it, in smaller print, "Police suspect no foul play." Arthur blinked. The page bore the Register's own masthead. The date read, November 1st, 1888. Tomorrow. "Who printed this?" he demanded. The boy shook his head. "No one, sir. The presses haven't run since 8. The editor tore the page in half and tossed it into the fire. But the flames sputtered blue and went out, leaving the paper untouched, its ink gleaming wetly in the dark. He told himself it was a prank, a rival paper perhaps, but when he sat down to write the next edition, the words refused to come. His pen scratched without ink, his hands shaking. In the silence, he heard a faint ticking, not from the clock, but from the linotype machine across the room. It wasn't moving, yet still it ticked, steady as a heartbeat. He stood. The sound stopped. He took a step closer, and the keys began to press themselves. Letter by letter, the words appeared. "Look outside." He turned toward the window. The fog pressed against the glass, thick as wool, and through it he could just make out a shape tall, human, unmoving. When he blinked, it was gone. He didn't stay the night. At dawn, the morning crew found the office empty, though the presses were warm, the rollers slick with ink. Stacked neatly beside them were dozens of freshly printed papers, every one identical. Editor found dead at his desk. But Arthur wasn't there. Not his coat, not his hat, only his pocket watch, lying open on the desk, its hands stopped at 12:47. The register shut down within the week. The presses were dismantled, the buildings sold, but printers in the district still talk of the ghost run, the nights when fog creeps thick through Fleet Street and the old machines stir to life on their own, stamping headlines that tell of disasters yet to happen. Some collectors claim to own one of those sheets, brittle, yellowed, the ink still faintly wet. Each bears the same closing line at the bottom margin. Printed one day early. The fog moved like a living thing that night, crawling up from the river, winding through alleys, draping itself over the city, until even the moon vanished behind its shroud. Somewhere in the distance, hooves struck stone, steady, deliberate, echoing against the hush. The first to see it was a flower girl near St. James's Square. She had lingered past midnight, counting her coins beneath a flickering lamp when the sound reached her. A carriage, she thought, though it moved too smoothly for the rutted cobbles. Out of the fog it came silent, black, gleaming as if carved from shadow. It bore no crest, no lanterns, no driver, yet it rolled forward without pause, the horse's eyes burning faint and blue. The girl stepped aside, clutching her basket. As it passed, she caught her reflection in the polished door, only it wasn't her face. It was older, hollow-eyed, lips moving in slow, soundless prayer. She screamed, but no one heard. When the watchman came running, she was gone, only her basket remained, the flowers pressed flat by wheel marks that led nowhere. The next night, a constable on Pall Mall reported a carriage crossing his path just before 2. The same dark, silent, unmarked. He raised his lantern, calling for the driver, but saw no hand on the reins. When he stepped into the road, the horses passed through him like smoke, leaving frost on his coat. He fell to his knees, gasping, his breath visible though the air was warm. By week's end, every district had its story. A doctor on Harley Street claimed to see it glide past his surgery window, its door swinging open to reveal an empty seat lined with velvet black as coal. A cabman swore it followed him home, wheels whispering behind him though no light shone in the mist. The rumors grew darker. Some said the carriage came for the dying. Others said it carried those who had already gone, still searching for their graves. Old women along the docks claimed they'd seen it emerge from the Thames itself, dripping water, its horses slick and silent as river eels. But the story that lingered came from a clerk named Peter Gray, who vanished on All Hallows Eve. His landlady awoke to the sound of hooves outside her window. Through the fog, she saw the black carriage stop at the door. A man stepped out, tall, pale, dressed like a gentleman of 50 years past. He tipped his hat to no one and disappeared inside. Moments later, the door opened again, and 2 figures emerged, the pale man and the clerk, walking side by side. Neither spoke. The landlady swore the clerk's feet never touched the ground. When the carriage vanished into the fog, she ran downstairs. The front door stood open. Peter Gray's coat still hung on its peg, his candle still burned on the table. But his chair was empty, and beside it, etched faintly into the wax of the desk, were the words, "The fare is paid." To this day, Londoners say that when the fog thickens blue over the river and the streets go quiet, you can still hear the phantom carriage passing through wheels, whispering, hooves striking in time with a heartbeat not your own. If it stops before you, don't look inside. Don't meet the eyes of the driver, because once you see your reflection in that glass door, you're already on board. It began with the smell, not the usual tang of barley and yeast that hung over Bishopsgate, but something sharp and metallic, a scent that turned stomachs and made the air taste wrong. The men at Dunlow and Sons Brewery noticed it first on Halloween morning 1888. The vats hissed too long, the pipes shuddered like something alive. Still they worked. Beer didn't brew itself, and the fog outside promised a cold night. By sunset, the courtyard shimmered with mist, the cobbles slick, the iron gates rattling in a wind no one could feel. Inside, the boilers roared. Workers shouted over the din, their voices bouncing off the brick arches. When the foreman, Mr. Isaac Dunlow, climbed the stairs to inspect the upper vat, he stopped halfway. The liquid inside the ale they'd brewed for the All Hallows feast wasn't amber, it was red. Rust in the line, someone muttered. But when they dipped a ladle, the metal came up clean. The smell deepened, copper and salt, like open wounds. Dunlow ordered the batch dumped, though every man hesitated. The fog had seeped through the open windows, and the liquid below seemed to move on its own, swirling in slow circles as though stirred by an invisible hand. "Fetch a priest," one worker whispered, but it was too late for prayers. The boiler hissed once, shrieked like a living thing, and burst a deafening roar of steam and red mist flooding the room. When it cleared, the vats were full again, brimming with the same crimson brew, warm and pulsing as though freshly drawn. 3 men lay scalded on the floor. A 4th stared at his reflection in the red surface and began to laugh. "They're thirsty," he said. "We brewed for them." That night, the city drank. Every tavern that bought Dunlow's ale poured from the new barrels, unaware of what lay within. Patrons swore it was the finest beer they'd ever tasted, thick, sweet, warming to the core. By morning, 6 of them were dead. The constables who came to investigate found the brewery silent. Every vat stood full again, though no one remained to tend them. The air was cold enough to frost glass, and on every wall letters had been traced in condensation, words written backward, as if from the inside: drink and remember. Dunlow himself was discovered in the fermentation room, kneeling before the largest barrel, his hands stained red to the elbows. His eyes were open, his face calm, as if listening to something that spoke only to him. The coroner's report noted that the liquid in the vats contained no barley or yeast, only water, salt, and iron. The brewery closed within a week, sealed by order of the city. But on fog-heavy nights, passers-by claimed to hear the faint clink of bottles rolling across the floor inside, and the smell that same copper tang seeps out from under the door. Every few years, a new public house opens in the district. The owners proudly serve their restored Dunlow blend, claiming it's an old family recipe. For a while, the beer flows freely. Then, one night, always on Halloween, the barrels turn red again, and the laughter from inside the empty brewery starts up once more, deep, hollow, and full of thirst. Highgate lay drowned in fog that night, its headstones rising from the mist like the ribs of something ancient and buried. The air smelled of earth and rain, and every tree seemed to lean inward, as if listening. The caretakers had gone home hours before, locking the gates behind them, leaving only the dead to keep time. But the clocks of Highgate had other plans. It was said that every graveyard keeps its own hour one, that never quite matches the living world. The clocks inside the caretaker's lodge were proof of it, always a few minutes slow, no matter how often they were wound. But on October 31st, 1888, those clocks stopped altogether. At exactly 9:13 p.m. The first to notice was Joseph Penfold, the youngest gravedigger, a boy with hands too soft for soil and eyes too curious for his own good. He'd stayed late, tidying tools, humming to keep away the dark. When the wind died, he heard it, a low ticking, faint and far, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. He thought it was a trick of the echo until it began to sync with his pulse. Tick, tick, tick. He followed the sound between the mausoleums, his lantern throwing long, thin shadows over marble angels slick with dew. The noise grew louder near an old family tomb, the kind whose name had worn away to nothing. From the stone door's cracks leaked a soft white mist, pulsing with each tick. "Anyone in there?" Joseph called, half joking. Something knocked back 3 times. He dropped his lantern. The glass shattered, and in that moment of dark, he heard a new sound, dozens of faint ticks joining the first, surrounding him, coming from the earth itself. He backed away, heart hammering, until his heel struck something solid. He turned and saw a pocket watch lying open on the ground. The second hand spun backward. By the time the other caretakers arrived at dawn, the fog had thinned. They found Joseph's shovel near the old tomb, but no sign of the boy. The soil before it had been disturbed, not dug into, but out of. Inside the lodge, the great wall clock had resumed ticking. Yet none of them could forget what they saw etched into the glass of its face, fine scratches forming words, faint but legible in the morning light. "Time is done." The clockmaker who examined it claimed the message had been carved from the inside. After that night, Highgate grew quiet again, mostly. But sometimes, when the air is damp and the fog curls low, visitors hear the sound of ticking beneath their feet. Not in rhythm with the living clocks of London, but slower, deeper, more patient. Caretakers say it's the dead keeping time for themselves, marking the hour when something went wrong in the world above. And if you linger past 9:13, you might feel it too, a faint vibration beneath the soil, like a heartbeat that doesn't belong to you. The tunnels beneath Baker Street were never meant for the living. They were dug deep and fast, a secret vein of London carved in haste to carry steam, telegraph wire, and the whispers of progress. But long before the trains arrived, long before the rails gleamed, something older had already made a home there. By 1888, the engineers knew better than to linger after dark. The air turned heavy in the lower shafts, and the torches burned strange blue at the edges, like a flame remembering the sea. Yet men kept digging. There was money in stone, and the city's hunger for tunnels had no end. On the evening of October 31st, a foreman named Samuel Orr led a crew of 12 into the unfinished passage beneath Baker Street Station. The fog above ground had thickened to a choking soup, but below, the air was still too still. The sound of their boots echoed back in patterns that didn't match their steps. By lantern light, the tunnel looked normal enough. Raw brick, damp mortar, a few puddles where water leaked through the roof. But as they advanced, Orr noticed something that froze his hand mid-swing. Someone had carved markings into the wall, not numbers, not letters, but long lines and dots arranged in sequences. They stretched for yards, like an ancient code. "Blasted prank," one of the men muttered. "Kids, maybe." But Orr knew better. The pattern was deliberate, rhythmic, almost musical. He tapped the wall once with his hammer. The tunnel answered. The echo came back late, not a simple bounce of sound, but a reply. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, tap. The men laughed nervously, pretending not to hear the difference. But then the message repeated, exactly the same. Morse. Someone was sending Morse code from the other side of the wall. Orr crouched, pressing his ear against the brick. The voice that followed wasn't one he could explain. It was faint but unmistakable, a chorus of whispers bleeding through the mortar, too many to count. Help. Cold. Down. He staggered back. Who's there? The wall pulsed, faintly warm. The tapping began again, faster now, desperate. One of the younger men, thinking it a joke, tapped back. Who are you? The answer came immediately. We built this first. The lamps went out. The crew bolted for the exit, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound of footsteps chasing them from behind, not echoes, but other feet. When Orr finally stumbled into the open shaft, He was alone. At dawn, search parties found his lantern still burning at the site. The wall where he'd been working was cracked down the center. Through the gap, they saw the outline of another tunnel, older, deeper, running parallel to theirs. Its bricks were slick with moisture, its floor covered in silt, and faintly, they could hear it, a steady tapping continuing long after all tools had been set down. The city sealed that section, of course, claimed it was unstable, unsafe, but railway workers still talk about the other tunnel beneath Baker Street, the one that was already there before London dug its own. Sometimes, when the trains pass overhead and the air trembles, you can still hear them, those lost voices tapping through the walls in a code no one dares to answer anymore. Because if you do, the tapping stops. And then you hear breathing, right behind you. Even before the fog came, the street behind Gray's Inn Lane had a way of swallowing sound. Cobblers, tinkers, tailors, all gone by dusk. But one light always burned late in the window of No. 47, the workshop of Mr. Felix Lorne, London's most peculiar doll-maker. He was not famous for beauty, though his work was exquisite. What made him notable was that every one of his dolls looked faintly sad. Their painted mouths trembled just shy of a frown, and their glass eyes glistened as if they understood the sorrow of being stared at forever. On Halloween night 1888, Mr. Lorne was working later than usual. Orders had piled up for Christmas, grandparents commissioning gifts for children they rarely saw. His lamp sputtered in the fog, throwing yellow light across a clutter of limbs, porcelain arms, papier-mâché faces, wigs of pale horsehair. They looked human enough that he sometimes apologized when he brushed them aside. Around midnight, he finished one last doll, a little girl in a blue silk dress, her eyes two perfect spheres of green glass, imported from France. He turned her head gently on its joint, smiling. "There now," he murmured. "Not a soul could tell you from the living." From the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "Not any more." He froze. The fog pressed against the window, thick as wool, and every doll in the shop seemed to lean slightly forward. He told himself it was the light, the fatigue. Still, when he turned back to the table, the new doll was smiling. He had not painted her that way. Her lips had parted just enough to show a row of tiny porcelain teeth. Her eyes gleamed wetly, not like glass, but like skin that had been alive once. He stepped back, breath-catching. Then came the sound, a soft click from the shelf behind him, followed by another and another, as jointed heads began to turn toward him in perfect unison. "Who's there?" he barked. "Stop that." But the dolls did not stop. Their faces shifted in the flickering light, smiles, grimaces, open mouths gasping like fish. A dozen pairs of glass eyes reflected him, shrinking, multiplying, until he could no longer tell which image was his. The fog seeped under the door. The lamp dimmed. By dawn, the neighbors found his workshop silent. Every doll sat neatly on its shelf, head straight, hands folded. But the newest one, the girl in blue, was gone. In her place lay a note written in Felix Lorne's delicate hand. She wanted her turn. They found him a week later at Highgate Cemetery, seated before a child's grave, his hair turned white. On his lap rested the doll, her eyes closed, her porcelain cheek pressed to his. His hands had stiffened around her waist, the fingers fused with varnish as if the two had been poured from the same mold. The workshop never reopened, but the dolls were sold off at auction. Collectors swore that the eyes of Lorne's creations followed them from room to room. And once, during a thunderstorm, a woman reported hearing a faint sound coming from inside one, something like a heartbeat, slow and steady. The police dismissed it as imagination. But the auctioneer burned the remaining dolls the next day, unwilling to risk another whisper from the fog. Still, sometimes a blue silk doll appears in shop windows across London, always perfectly clean, always unsold. Her face looks different each time, sometimes smiling, sometimes sad. And if you stare too long, her lips move. Covent Garden had always belonged to the living, its laughter, its music, its cheap gin and expensive promises. But on the night of October 31st, 1888, the laughter died mid-breath. The fog rolled in through the arches like a tide of ghosts, curling around the pillars and slipping under the red velvet doors of the Orpheum Theatre. Inside, the chandeliers burned gold above an audience dressed in jewels and expectation. The play was a new sensation. The tragedy of Lysandra, a melodrama about love, death, and resurrection. The star, Miss Ada Thorne, was adored by all London. She had a voice that could make sinners weep and skeptics kneel. But tonight, her voice trembled. She'd told the stagehand earlier that something had followed her from her dressing room, a scent of lilies, a cold breath against her neck. He'd laughed it off. Just nerves, miss. By the third act, the fog had found its way inside. It coiled between the rafters, rolling across the stage floor in thin white ribbons. The audience thought it was an effect, clever use of dry ice or hidden pipes, but the actors knew better. The theatre had no such tricks. Miss Thorne stepped forward, candle in hand, ready to deliver her final line. Love dies only when the heart forgets to beat. But her words caught in her throat. The flame flickered blue. The fog rose higher, wrapping her ankles, her waist, her throat. She gasped once, eyes wide, and then the candle fell, extinguished before it hit the floor. The stage went black. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the orchestra began to play again, soft, hesitant, though no one was seated at the instruments. The curtains stirred as if in a breeze, and a voice rang out through the dark. It was Ada's, but not from the stage. From above. Every head tilted upward. She was there, or something shaped like her, suspended in the mist, glowing faintly, her dress moving as if underwater. Her mouth opened, and she finished the line she hadn't been able to speak. Love dies only when the heart forgets. The words trailed into silence. When the house lights rose, the stage was empty. The audience sat frozen, their applause strangled before it began. No body was found. Only her dress, folded neatly at center stage, still warm to the touch. The Orpheum shut its doors the next morning, citing mechanical failure. But the actors whispered that Ada Thorne had never left. Every Halloween since, the stage lights flicker on by themselves at midnight, the curtains part, and a woman's voice sings one verse from the old play, her pitch flawless, her sorrow infinite. Visitors claim to see a figure moving behind the smoke, pale and slow as if caught between a bow and a final breath. And the ushers who dare to listen from the back row swear they can hear something else, applause that fades too soon, and a whisper in the rafters. Love dies only when the audience forgets. In the labyrinth of alleys behind Clerkenwell Green stood a small shop with no name, its window crowded by clocks of every shape and age. Grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches suspended like golden fruit from threads of wire, all ticking softly, their rhythms just slightly out of sync, as though the air itself couldn't keep up. The man who tended them was Mr. Elias Gower, a clockmaker so skilled that even the city's magistrates sent their timepieces to him. But what the customers didn't know was that Elias had once built something far stranger than a clock. The story began on the night of October 31st, 1888 a night, when the fog made even the bells of Street Paul's sound muffled and wrong. Gower was hunched over his bench, his fingers trembling from fatigue. The lamp burned low beside him, casting a single circle of light amid the shadows of hundreds of motionless faces, each clock frozen at the same moment, 11:59. He'd stopped them himself hours earlier. He couldn't stand to hear them anymore. For months, Elias had been haunted by a single sound, a tick that didn't belong to any of his clocks. It came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the hollow behind his ribcage, always steady, always just beneath hearing. When he worked, it grew louder. When he tried to sleep, it spoke his name. He told himself it was the echo of his craft, that the constant rhythm of his trade had rewired his mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had built it. a clock that could measure regret. Years earlier, after his wife Margaret had died of fever, Elias had sworn he would find a way to keep her hour. He'd taken a lock of her hair, a drop of her blood, and sealed them inside a pocket watch he crafted by hand, a masterpiece of gears and sorrow. When it first began to tick, it matched his own heartbeat. But soon it began to run on its own. And lately, it had started to speak. Now, on this final night of October, Elias sat with the watch before him on the workbench. Its hands spun backward, its case pulsing faintly as if alive. The ticking had become a whisper, not mechanical but human. "Elias." He flinched. The voice was hers. "Elias, you promised me time." His breath fogged the glass. Inside, the hands trembled, then stilled at 12. The fog outside thickened until it seeped beneath the door, curling around his ankles. Every clock in the shop began to tick again, not in rhythm, but chaos. Hundreds of heartbeats colliding. He reached for the pocket watch, desperate to wind it back, but the key would not turn. "Please," he whispered, "I only wanted to stop losing you." The voice came again, soft and terrible. "Then come with me." The glass cracked. The fog surged. When neighbors forced the door open the next morning, they found the workshop empty. Every clock had stopped at the same instant, 12:1. Only the pocket watch remained on the bench, open and silent, its face reflecting a faint shape that wasn't their own. They say the shop still stands, shuttered, though no one remembers who owns it. And when the fog rolls in thick over Clerkenwell, the clocks inside begin to tick once more, all in perfect unison, all keeping the same impossible time. The time Margaret Gower died. Beneath the cobblestone calm of Clerkenwell lies a second city, one carved not from ambition, but from bone and damp and silence. Most Londoners never knew it existed. Those who did, the masons and monks of centuries past, took the secret with them into the earth. But on Halloween night, 1888, that secret woke up. It began when the ground gave way behind St. John's Gate. A horse cart sank half its wheel through the pavement, and when the driver peered down into the crack, he saw a hollow space yawning beneath him, too deep for his lantern to touch. The fog thickened fast, and something in the darkness below exhaled. By morning, a team of workers was sent to inspect the sinkhole. Among them was Thomas Reed, a city engineer with more curiosity than sense. He led the way down a rope ladder into the breach 20 feet, then 40, until his boots met ancient stone. The air down there was dry and stale, older than London itself. His lantern threw trembling light across a corridor lined with carvings, angels with closed eyes, mouths sewn shut. "Monastic," one man muttered. "Old priory tunnels, maybe." But the further they went, the less the carvings looked like angels. Their faces stretched too long, their hands clawed against the walls. The inscriptions beneath them were in no Latin any scholar could read. At the corridor's end stood a heavy oak door banded with rusted iron. A symbol was burned into its center, a circle with 7 spokes. Reed, fascinated, pressed his hand against it. The wood was warm. From beyond came the faintest hum, like wind through a pipe organ. "Best not," said one of the crew. "We've seen enough." Reed smiled. "Not nearly." He forced the latch. The door swung inward onto a vast chamber, its ceiling lost to shadow. The light revealed row upon row of niches carved into the stone, each holding a skull, perfectly arranged, their eye sockets gleaming with moisture. Thousands of them. The hum grew louder, pulsing through the walls. "Back up," someone hissed. "Now." But Reed stepped forward, entranced. The skulls were vibrating faintly, in rhythm with the sound. He raised his lantern closer and saw his own reflection in one of the hollow eyes. Then the hum stopped. For a moment, the silence was complete. Then came the whisper. It wasn't one voice, but many, layered so tightly it felt like wind moving through bone. "Remember us." Reed's lantern shattered. Darkness consumed the chamber. The workers scrambled for the rope, shouting his name, but when they reached the surface, only 5 of the 6 emerged. The last man's voice echoed once from below, soft, awed, and wrong. "They're awake." The city sealed the hole the next day, pouring stone and iron until the ground held firm. But sometimes, when the fog settles deep around Clerkenwell, the pavement trembles ever so slightly as if something below is breathing. Modern tunnelers claim their drills falter near that spot, the engines choking for no reason, their instruments picking up faint, steady vibrations. A pattern, 7 beats, a pause, 7 more. The mark of the circle, with 7 spokes. No one digs there now, not anymore. Because the ones who do come back change their eyes, reflecting the faintest shimmer, like lanterns lit from within. The fog crept into Bloomsbury before dawn, curling along the rooftops like smoke from a fire that never went out. Inside a small attic studio on Russell Square, a painter named Gabriel March brushed the last strokes onto the canvas that would kill him. He was not famous, not yet. His portraits had promise, critics said, but they lacked life. That changed the night he met her. A woman in grey, quiet as dust, who appeared at his door during the storm 3 weeks earlier. "You paint faces," she'd said, voice low as falling ash. "Would you paint mine?" He had tried to ask her name, but she smiled and said only, "Names fade faster than paint." She sat for him each night after that, never moving, never speaking, her pale eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. The longer he painted her, the harder it became to remember her features, not because she lacked them, but because they seemed to shift, like water under candlelight. Still, the work consumed him. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, painting feverishly as the fog outside thickened with every passing day. By the last evening of October 1888, he was nearly finished. The candle burned low beside him, its flame shivering each time he dipped his brush. The woman sat across from him as always, silent, patient. "I think," he murmured, "I've captured you at last." Her voice came soft from the shadows. "Then, you're the first." He paused. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked toward the canvas. "Look closely." He stepped back, wiping his hands on his smock, and raised the lantern. For the first time, he truly looked. The painting was perfect, too perfect. The skin glowed with life, the eyes gleamed with depth, the mouth seemed about to move, but there was something else, something wrong. The reflection in the eyes on the canvas wasn't of him, it was of her standing behind him. The flame guttered. He spun around. The chair was empty, only her shawl remained, draped neatly across the seat. He turned back to the painting and froze. Her figure on the canvas was no longer sitting. She was standing, her hand extended toward him, her painted mouth curved into the faintest smile. Then the canvas rippled. The next morning, the landlady found the studio locked from within. She called the constables, who broke down the door. The room was cold, the windows fogged from the inside. The easel stood at the center, holding a single canvas. The painting showed Gabriel March seated at his work table, palette in hand, eyes wide, forever caught in the act of painting the woman behind him. But there was no second chair in the room, no sign of anyone else. The coroner wrote "natural causes" and moved on, but the portrait remained passed from collector to collector, each claiming they could see the woman's reflection shift slightly from one viewing to the next. Some swore she blinked, others claimed she smiled only when no one was watching. The painting now hangs in a private collection, locked behind glass. But every Halloween, condensation blooms on the inside of the case, as if something within still breathes. They say Gabriel finally painted life, not borrowed it, but invited it in. And it never left. On the southern edge of Hampstead Heath stood a modest townhouse of white stone and black shutters, belonging to the Whitakers, a respectable family of 4 who prided themselves on order. Their clocks ran on time, their curtains matched the seasons, and their children, Margaret and Philip, said their prayers without fail. But that autumn, London's fog had grown restless. It did not stop at the door. On the evening of October 31st, 1888, Mr. Whittaker latched every window, stuffed cloth in the cracks, and remarked with satisfaction that not a breath of this city's filth shall touch us. The gaslights inside burned steady, the hearth crackled. The family retired with cocoa and scripture, unaware that the mist had already found its way in, not through the doors, but through the walls. It began as a smell, faint as damp linen. Then came the chill. By midnight, the fire was out, though the coals still glowed. The mother, Lydia, rose to add kindling and noticed the wallpaper shifting, a ripple moving slowly along the seam, as if something inside the plaster were breathing. She touched it. The wall was cold, slick with moisture. Her finger came away pale grey. Behind her, she heard her husband whisper her name, only it wasn't quite his voice. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, his outline faint in the dim gaslight. "Go back to bed," she said, shivering. He didn't move. Then, softly, the sound of their son's laughter echoed from upstairs. But the boy was asleep. She could hear him breathing from his room above. The laughter grew louder. By the time Mr. Whittaker truly entered the room, the real Mr. Whittaker, Lydia was pressed against the wall, trembling. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. "The children?" They ran upstairs together. The nursery door stood open. The fog pooled thick on the floorboards like spilled milk. The children lay in bed, eyes open, unblinking. "Margaret? Philip?" Both turned their heads at once. Their mouths moved together, speaking with one voice. "It's warmer here," they said. The lamps blew out. Neighbors passing by the next morning found the Whittaker home still lit, curtains drawn tight. By noon, when no one had stirred, the constables forced the door. Inside, every mirror had fogged from within. The gaslights hissed a pale blue, though the mains were shut off. Upstairs, the beds were empty, but the indentations of 4 bodies remained, still warm. No one ever lived there again. Over the years, the house became known as the Breather's Place. Fog gathers thicker around it than anywhere else in Hampstead, even on clear nights. Those who walk past after midnight sometimes hear soft voices through the shutters, a family murmuring prayers in unison, or laughter that fades as the mist rolls higher. And once, a lamplighter swore he saw shadows moving inside the fog behind the window. 4 figures, faint but certain, looking out as if from underwater. He said they seemed happy, calm, at home. The fog didn't just come for the Whittakers that night. It came to stay. By the time the fog reached Waterloo Bridge, the Thames was more ghost than river, its surface shifting with light that came from nowhere. The bridge stretched pale across the mist, its lamps burning low, their reflections trembling like eyes just about to close. Constable James Porter made his patrol there most nights, walking the long span between the statues and the silence. The river below always unnerved him. It had a way of speaking back. Some nights it gurgled, some nights it whispered, but on Halloween of 1888 it began to weep. At first he thought it was the sound of rain against the stone, but when he looked down, the bridge was dry. Still, the sobbing continued, soft, rhythmic, distinctly human. He followed it toward the center arch, where the fog was thickest, and called out, "Who's there? Speak up now." A woman's voice answered, small and shaking. "Please don't look at me." He froze. "Miss, you're in danger. Let me help you." "No," she whispered. "It's too late." The fog shifted, and he saw her, a figure in a tattered shawl, hair hanging long and wet, her feet bare against the stone. Her face was turned toward the water, and though she did not move, the air around her rippled like heat above a fire. "Step away from the edge," he ordered, reaching for her shoulder. When his hand touched fabric, it sank through nothing but cold. The woman dissolved, her shape scattering like smoke in wind. In her place remained only a damp patch on the railing and the faint sound of sighing. James staggered back, heart pounding. But as he turned, the fog rolled again, and there she was, further down the bridge this time, her form flickering in and out like a lantern guttering in the dark. Behind her, more shapes began to appear, dozens of them. Men, women, even children, all standing in silence, each looking down into the river with expressions of infinite sorrow. Their outlines pulsed faintly, blue against the grey, as though lit from below. "God help us," James whispered. And then they spoke, not loud, not in anger, but as a single exhale that carried centuries of grief. "Do you hear us now?" The bridge groaned beneath their weight, though none of them moved. For one awful moment, the constable felt the stone shift, as if pulled by the tide. He stumbled to the railing, gripping it tight. The water below churned white, and in its reflection, he saw not one bridge but two, the living and the dead, side by side, stretching into infinity. When he blinked, they were gone. At dawn, the patrol found him kneeling in the center of the bridge, his uniform soaked to the bone, his eyes open but unfocused. He lived, though he never spoke again. His notebook contained only one line, scrawled over and over until the page tore. They never stopped falling. Now, when the fog thickens over Waterloo and the river hushes beneath it, some say you can still hear them, the sighs of those who never reached the other side. They say if you listen too long, you'll feel their hands brush yours on the railing, cold, pleading and pulling gently downward. Whitechapel had always known two sounds, the strike of hammers and the echo of bells. Even the fog couldn't silence them. The Whitechapel Bell Foundry had forged every tone that marked London's hours: church bells, courthouse chimes, the grand iron voice of Big Ben itself. But on Halloween night, 1888, the foundry made a bell no one ordered and no one survived to hear. The men on shift that evening were veterans of the trade, soot-streaked, muscle-bound, unafraid of heat or noise. They worked by the rhythm of molten metal, the clang and hiss that filled their lungs with smoke. Their foreman, Thomas Grail, had been in charge for 20 years. He swore by craft, not superstition. Yet even he felt the air turn strange before midnight. The furnace burned too hot. The flames shone blue instead of orange, licking the air like tongues of gaslight. The moulds trembled where they stood. Still, he barked for the poor to begin. "Let's earn our bread, lads." The crucible tipped, the molten bronze poured, shining like the surface of the Sunday. But as it flowed, it began to move wrong, twisting, doubling back against gravity, swirling into shapes none of them could name. Someone shouted. The mixture hissed, spat sparks, and then steadied again, settling into the great bell mold as if guided by invisible hands. When it cooled, the room fell silent. The bell inside the mold gave a single soft knock as though struck gently from within. Thomas ordered the men home. He stayed behind to finish the casting. Alone in the foundry, he heard it again, a faint metallic breath, a resonance that didn't fade. He touched the surface, and warmth pulsed through the bronze, beating slow like a heart. Curiosity won. He lifted his hammer and struck it once. The tone that answered was unlike any bell ever forged. It rang low and perfect, yet hollow, carrying something almost human beneath it, the sound of a sigh turned inside out. The foundry windows shattered. Pigeons took flight across Whitechapel, and the fog outside turned inward, flooding the workshop in a single grey wave. When the other smiths arrived at dawn, they found the floor scorched to black glass. The mould lay cracked open. Inside was a bell, the colour of tarnished bone, unpolished, cold to the touch. Thomas Grail was nowhere to be found. They melted the bell that same day, pouring it into the Thames under police order, but witnesses said it didn't sink. It rolled once, twice, and vanished beneath the fog, the water ringing softly as if struck again. Weeks later, the churches nearest the foundry reported strange harmonics in their bells, tones that appeared only on foggy nights, deep enough to rattle windows. The priests called them echoes, the bellmen called them warnings. Even now, the old workers say the foundry keeps a sound the rest of London can't hear, a low, continuous hum that vibrates in the floorboards. If you stand alone there after midnight, it begins to change pitch, rising slowly until it becomes a whisper. No one agrees on the words. Some say it's Thomas Grail calling for release. Others say it's the bell still ringing beneath the Thames, waiting for someone to answer it. The fog lingered late that November, thick as smoke, slow as thought, wrapping the city in silence. Even the bells couldn't break. In a narrow townhouse off Gower Street, a widower named Henry Latham sat by the fire, listening to it burn low. The coals pulsed orange, then blue, then dimmed, and still he stayed awake, as he had every night since her death. He'd loved Marianne since youth, 20 years of laughter, quarrels, and rain-soaked mornings by the window. She had died suddenly, leaving no letter, no farewell. The house was too quiet now. The air still held her perfume, faint as memory, and sometimes he thought he heard her footsteps on the stair, soft, careful, turning back halfway, as she always did. On the morning of October 31st, 1888, the first letter came. It was plain, unmarked, left on the mat with the day's post. The envelope bore his name in a hand he hadn't seen in months, the precise, looping script of his late wife. His chest tightened. The paper was dry, the seal intact, the scent faintly of lavender. But when he tore it open, the page inside was blank. Completely blank. He turned it toward the firelight. The heat made faint lines appear, then vanish. He fetched his spectacles, held the paper to the lamp. No ink, no watermark. Only a single tear in the corner, like the mark of a fingernail. He locked it away in the drawer and told no one. The second letter arrived the next night, then the third, each blank, each folded the same way. By the sixth, Henry could no longer sleep. He swore the envelopes rustled on their own when the house was quiet, as though something inside were trying to breathe. On the seventh night, the fog pressed hard against the windows, curling beneath the frame like smoke through a keyhole. He lit a single candle and opened the drawer. The letters waited, pale as bone. "Marianne?" he whispered. He took one sheet, pressed it to the flame's edge. This time, the heat brought words, faint, grey, rising from nowhere. "I never left." The candle guttered out. The letters scattered, rising like startled birds, swirling in the dark until they fell to the floor. He knelt, heart hammering, and saw that every page now bore a line not written but etched, pressed from the inside of the paper. The next morning the maid found the house empty, the fire cold, the letters gone all but one, lying on the hearth, its message clear. Ink fades, love doesn't. Years later, tenants who rented the house complained that their post boxes filled with blank envelopes each October. Some burned them, some kept them, and a few claimed that, under lamplight, the paper showed faint words, not a letter, but a promise. "I'm coming home." And each time they opened another envelope, the message grew clearer. The British Museum never truly slept. Even in 1888, its marble halls breathed after hours, the faint creak of timber, the drip of condensation, the restless echo of footsteps that belonged to no one at all. Most blamed the pipes, others blamed history. But for Thomas Dale, the museum's night watchman, it was something else entirely. He'd walked those galleries for 17 years, his lantern swinging through corridors of glass-eyed statues and mummified kings. He liked the quiet, the smell of dust and polish, the steady company of things too old to move. But on the night of October 31st, something did move. It began in the Egyptian wing. The fog outside pressed hard against the skylights, turning the moonlight to milk. Thomas paused by the sarcophagus of a priest-king whose name he could never pronounce. Normally he'd tip his cap and mutter, "Evenin', sir," a small superstition of his. But tonight, the air around the coffin felt warm like breath on his face. The lantern's flame bent sideways. From somewhere deep in the hall came the sound of a footstep. Then another. He called out, "Who's there?" And his voice came back wrong, too fast, too close. He turned down the next corridor and froze. The statues had shifted. He could have sworn their poses were different. Heads turned toward him, eyes fixed, marble mouths parted as though caught mid-sentence. The light shook in his hand. "No games now," he muttered, forcing a laugh. "You're stone." A whisper answered from the dark. "Were you not?" He stumbled back, striking his lantern against the wall. Sparks danced across the glass. For an instant, the corridor glowed red, and in that flash he saw what no man was meant to see: hundreds of statues, figures, relics, all breathing. Their chests rose and fell in the same rhythm, as if the fog itself had filled their lungs. He ran, past the Mesopotamian idols, past the skeleton in its case, his boots echoing like gunfire. But every corner turned him back upon himself, until he found he'd returned to the same hall, the Egyptian wing. The sarcophagus stood open. The fog poured from it like smoke from a furnace. Inside was not a mummy but a mirror, tall and black, its surface rippling like water. He raised his lantern and saw his own reflection staring back, though it did not move as he did. The reflection smiled. The flame died. At dawn the guards found Thomas's lantern on the floor, the wick burned to nothing. His cap lay beside it. There was no sign of the man himself, only a faint imprint of a hand on the glass of the sarcophagus, the fingers splayed as though pressed from inside. The museum sealed that hall for restoration, though the staff still speak of the extra watchman who appears in the closing hours. They see him in the corners of their eyes, lantern in hand, uniform immaculate, face pale as dust. He never speaks. He only nods, turns, and disappears down a corridor that no longer exists. Visitors sometimes claim they feel him pass behind them, cold air brushing their necks as they admire the statues. If they look too long into the marble eyes, they swear they see him reflected there, still walking his rounds, forever keeping watch. They called it Fog Lane long before the haunting began. The name fit too well a quiet stretch between Clapham and Balham, where the mist gathered thickest and lingered longest, even on clear days. Only 3 houses stood there in 1888, tall and proper, their windows shuttered like eyelids guarding a secret. The lane's 3 residents were men of means and reputation: Mr. Alistair Hume, a barrister, Dr. Silas Fairbrook, a physician, and Reverend John Avery, a clergyman of the highest esteem. Neighbours called them the Gentlemen of Fog Lane, for they dined together each Friday, playing cards and discussing politics by gaslight until the early hours. Their friendship was impeccable, their respectability unblemished, until Halloween night. The fog that evening was not the usual soft grey. It came rolling in black and heavy, muffling the sound of hooves and swallowing lamplight whole. Still, the 3 gentlemen gathered at Hume's house as they always did. Servants were dismissed early. Only the butler remained, tending the fire and pouring brandy as the men settled into their familiar arguments. At 11:30, the first knock came. 3 raps on the door, measured, deliberate. "Expecting anyone?" Dr. Fairbrook asked. Hume shook his head. "Not at this hour." The butler opened the door to emptiness. The fog pressed inside, thick and cold, and the fire dim to embers. He swore he heard someone whisper his name before shutting it again. When he turned back, one of the gentlemen was missing. Reverend Avery's chair sat empty, his glass of brandy untouched, his coat still on the peg. They searched the house, calling for him, but the rooms were empty, the walls slick with moisture. Outside, the fog glowed faintly blue, pulsing in rhythm with the chiming clock. "Best we wait for dawn," said Hume, his voice unsteady. "The police will find him come morning." They returned to the parlour. Only 2 glasses now. At midnight, the second knock came softer, nearer. Dr. Fairbrook rose. "This is foolishness," he said. "I'll put an end to it." He strode to the door, threw it open, and vanished into the fog. The butler swore the mist swallowed him whole. No sound, no struggle, just gone. The door slammed itself shut, shaking the house. Hume stood frozen, staring at the space where his friend had been. Then came the 3rd knock, not from the door this time, but from the inside of the window. He turned. 3 shapes stood outside in the fog, faint outlines of men, faces obscured, their heads bowed, their hands pressed to the glass. The fog behind them glowed brighter until it filled the room like water. When the constables arrived the next morning, they found the butler unconscious beside the hearth. The parlour reeked of damp earth. 3 brandy glasses sat in a neat row on the table, all full, all untouched, but faint fingerprints rimmed each one as though pressed from the inside. Of the gentlemen, there was no trace. Their hats and coats hung neatly in the hall, their cards laid out mid-game. The police wrote it off as disappearance by unexplained means. But the neighbours know better. Each Halloween the fog thickens down Fog Lane, no matter the weather. Around midnight, 3 figures appear in the mist, walking side by side, their outlines faint but unmistakable, their shoes making no sound. If you greet them, they tip their hats politely. If you follow them, you never come back. Down by the river, where the warehouses leaned like old men and the water stank of tar and brine, Limehouse lay half drowned in fog. The sailors called it the city's throat, where London swallowed the sea and spat out ghosts. It was there, among the shuttered inns and groaning docks, that the widow Agnes Webb heard the first knock. Her husband had drowned the previous year, thrown from a cargo barge in the black water near Wapping. The tide had carried him off, his body never returned. Every night since, Agnes lit a candle by the door, whispering the same prayer, "If you come back, let me know it's you." On the first Halloween after his death, her prayer was answered. The knock came just after midnight, 3 slow raps on the wood, the same rhythm her husband had used whenever he forgot his key. She froze in her chair, the half-knit shawl falling from her lap. The fog pressed hard against the windows, and the flame of her candle bent sideways, though no wind stirred. "Tom?" she whispered. Silence. Then 3 more knocks. She rose, heart hammering, and reached for the latch. The metal was ice cold, slick with condensation. When she opened the door, the fog rolled in like breath. The steps were empty. Only the faintest wet footprints marked the stone, leading away toward the river. She followed. Down past the shuttered warehouses, the lamps burned blue and thin, their light swallowed by the mist. She could hear the water now, lapping softly against the docks. And over it, faintly, came a sound she knew too well, the creak of a rope, the soft roll of a boat against wood. "Tom?" she called again. A shadow moved at the edge of the pier, tall, stooped, dripping. The figure turned. His hat was gone, his hair plastered to his skull, his coat glistening with river water. His face was hidden beneath the brim of darkness, but his hand rose slowly, beckoning. Agnes took 1 step forward. The boards groaned underfoot. "I kept the candle," she said. "I waited." The figure tilted his head, and in a voice like water moving through reeds, he whispered, "You left the door open." The next morning, the lamplighter found her shawl tangled in the pier ropes, soaked but warm. The candle by her door had burned to its base, its wax running in lines that looked almost like writing. No one could agree on what the words said. Some claimed they read home, others swore they read below. In the years that followed, Limehouse sailors told stories of a knocking sound that echoed through the fog before a storm, soft, deliberate, always 3 times. They said it came from doors, from hulls, from coffins nailed too tight. Even now, when the tide is high and the river runs black, those who live near the docks light a candle on Halloween night. Not to keep the ghosts away, but to keep them from knocking. And if you hear it 1, 2, 3, don't open the door, because whoever waits outside already knows your name. The fog over Bishopsgate came down early that night, dense as wool, swallowing the gaslight before it could reach the ground. The city seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, the lamplighter moved his pole tapping lightly against the stones, his boots leaving no sound behind. His name was Edwin Pike, 19 years old and proud of his new post. He'd walked the same route every evening for 3 months, 57 lamps from Aldgate to Shoreditch, each one lit and trimmed with careful hands. The work was lonely, but he liked it that way. The lamps were his company, his stars, he called them. I bring them to life when the sun forgets. On the night of October 31st, 1888, he started late. The fog had crept up the Thames, thick and low, and the other lamplighters had already gone home. But Edwin refused to leave his last round undone. "No darkness gets the better of me," he'd said. The first few lamps flared easily, their small flames hissing blue. But as he reached the middle of the route, near the old iron bridge, the fog thickened until the world turned grey and shapeless. He could barely see the next post. He lit it anyway, and the flame sputtered like a heartbeat. Then came the sound, another set of footsteps, faint, matching his own. He turned. "Halloo there?" No answer. Only the soft clink of metal, the exact sound his pole made when it struck a lamp's rim. He frowned and moved on, lighting the next lamp, then the next. Each one burned lower than the last, as though the fog were swallowing the light whole. When he reached the end of the street, he noticed something strange. The lamps he had already passed were glowing again, but brighter, whiter, each one alive with a cold flame that didn't flicker. He stepped back, confused. That's not my fire. The last lamp ahead remained unlit. Beneath it stood a shadow, tall, thin, holding a pole just like his. "Evening," Edwin called. "You lost your way?" The figure tilted its head. No face showed beneath the cap, only the dull gleam of wet glass. It raised its own lighter, touched the flame to the lamp, and for one awful moment the fog lit up like sunrise. Every lamp along the street flared in unison, shining not yellow but blue, until the air itself shimmered. In that light, Edwin saw them all, dozens of lamplighters, pale and still, each standing by a post, each face blurred as if hidden behind glass. Every one of them turned toward him. He ran. The fog chased him, breathing down his neck, the hiss of gas roaring louder than the wind. He made it halfway across the bridge before his flame went out. At dawn, they found his pole lying on the bridge rail, his cap still hanging from the hook. The lamps he'd lit the night before were dark, except for one. The final lamp on Bishopsgate still burned, its flame steady and white. Inside its glass, faint fingerprints smudged the soot, one small, one large, both pressed from the inside. Each Halloween since, the Bishopsgate lamps light themselves before dusk, one by one, without flame or hand. And at the far end of the street, under the last lamp, a boy's shadow still moves, reaching up with an invisible pole, keeping his promise to the dark. Mayfair's grand parlours were built to impress, their mirrors tall and merciless, the kind that showed you not who you were, but who society required you to be. In the winter of 1888, one such mirror hung in the drawing-room of Lady Eugenia Harcourt, widow, patroness, and rumoured collector of the uncanny. She had 12 mirrors in all, one for each month, each imported from a different corner of Europe. But it was the 13th, the one she swore she never bought, that changed everything. It arrived without warning on Halloween morning, its surface veiled in black cloth, its deliveryman nameless and pale. "A gift from an admirer," he said, his voice low and strange. She offered him a coin. He refused, saying only, "Be sure it faces no door." Then he vanished into the fog. Lady Harcourt, intrigued, ignored his warning. That evening she unveiled the mirror and placed it across from her favourite chair, directly opposite the parlour door. Its frame was wrought iron, twisted like vines, and the glass shimmered faintly, not clear, but faintly rippling, like water caught in a breeze. She thought it a trick of the light, until the first guest arrived. Her soirees were legendary philosophers, poets, actors, and liars, all gathered to gossip under candlelight. But as the night wore on, people began to glance toward the mirror. Some saw their reflections lag behind by a heartbeat. Others claimed their mirrored selves smiled when they did not. One woman fainted outright, insisting that her reflection had winked at her. Lady Harcourt laughed, brushing it off as champagne and superstition. Yet, when the guests departed, she noticed something unnerving. The room in the mirror still held 12 people, though only she remained. She counted again. 12. She blew out the candles. The mirrored flames stayed lit. By dawn, the servants found her seated before the glass, motionless, her eyes wide and gleaming like polished silver. Her handprint stained the mirror's surface, though no dust lay anywhere else. When they tried to move her, the glass shifted just slightly, revealing a second figure behind her reflection, reaching out. The coroner ruled it heart failure. The mirror was removed to storage, covered once more in black, but the servants whispered that Lady Harcourt's reflection lingered long after her burial. Some nights, when they passed the parlour door, they saw a pale face in the darkened glass, smiling faintly, waiting for someone to notice she was still there. The mirror was auctioned decades later, resurfacing in a small shop off Piccadilly. The proprietor claimed it brought good luck until he caught his own reflection moving on its own, stepping closer to the surface while he stood still. He shut the shop the next day. The mirror was last seen in the window of a collector's home in Chelsea, faintly fogged from within. Neighbours say that at night, when the city sleeps, they sometimes see a woman standing inside the glass, adjusting her gloves, counting invisible guests. 12 mirrors for the world she left behind, and the 13th for the one she entered. When the fog rolled thickest over London, even time seemed to lose its footing. The clocks lagged, the river slowed, and the bells, those proud iron hearts of the city, forgot when to ring. But on Halloween of 1888, they remembered all at once. It began with a hum. Just before midnight, the night watchman along the Thames reported hearing a faint vibration underfoot, like the city itself was inhaling. The gas lamps flickered blue, the pigeons took flight in silence, and then the bells began to toll. Not just St. Paul's, not just Westminster, but all of them. Every bell in London struck at once. From the smallest parish to the grandest cathedral, the sound rose through the fog like thunder turned inward. The city shook. Windows shivered in their frames. Dogs howled and carriages stopped mid-street as the air turned heavy, trembling with metal and something deeper, something that wasn't sound but memory. In a watchtower near Blackfriars, an old bellman named Charles Dane clung to the rope, staring upward in disbelief. He hadn't touched the cord. None of them had. The bell was swinging on its own, great and furious, the rope whipping like a serpent. "Stop it!" one of the men shouted. "We'll bring the roof down." But Charles wasn't listening. He was hearing something else, words, faint but distinct, hidden in the ring. The tones weren't random. They were voices. At first, they sang. Then they spoke. "Count the dead," they said. He dropped the rope. The sound didn't stop. It grew clearer, layered, like hundreds of throats speaking through metal. The bells didn't toll the hour they spoke it. Each stroke was a name, each echo a life long since buried. At Street Olaves, a vicar ran into the street, shouting that the bells were naming his entire congregation, one by one, in perfect order. At Bow Church, the sexton heard his own mother's voice, whispering prayers she'd taught him as a boy. And in Whitechapel, where the great foundry once poured molten bronze into mould, the air vibrated until the ground itself rang like a drum. When the 13th toll came, everything stopped. The fog hung motionless. The echo of the bells seemed to travel inward, vanishing into the earth rather than the air. For a heartbeat, the whole city felt hollow. Then silence. By morning, the bells hung still in their towers. Their clappers had fused to the sides, as if welded by heat. The ropes were singed, the metal slick with condensation that smelled faintly of iron and candle smoke. The bellmen refused to climb the towers again, claiming they could still feel something breathing inside the bronze. Charles Dane never spoke another word. When asked what he'd heard, he only wrote 4 on a scrap of paper before the ink bled and the page went blank. They were never silent. Since that night, London's bells have tolled differently on fog-heavy evenings. The sound lingers longer, curving low, carrying not just through the streets but into the bones of those who listen too closely. And sometimes, if you stand beneath the bell tower at midnight, when the fog wraps the rope like a noose, you can still hear the 13th toll, faint and late, ringing for someone who hasn't died yet. By the dawn of November 1st, 1888, the fog had devoured everything: streets, spires, sound, even time itself. London lay wrapped in silence so deep that it seemed the whole city had been buried alive. No clocks struck, no wheels turned. The air hung thick and pale, muffling even the river's breath. Those few who wandered the streets later would swear that for 1 full hour London stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The first to notice was a milkman crossing Holborn Viaduct. His horse froze mid-step, muscles locked, eyes wide. The cart wheels, still turning, left no tracks behind them. He dismounted, heart pounding, and realized he could no longer hear the sound of his own breathing. When he shouted, the words died inches from his mouth. In Westminster, a journalist on his way to Fleet Street found the fog too bright, almost luminous, as if it glowed from within. Figures stood along the embankment, men, women, children, silent, unmoving. He approached one, touched her shoulder, and found she was warm. But when he looked closer, she wasn't breathing. All across the city, the same stillness fell. Bakers froze at their ovens, chimney sweeps mid-step on rooftops, carriages poised at crossings like statues. The gas lamps flickered but didn't burn. Their flames stretched long and thin, pointing toward the ground. Only the fog moved slowly, deliberately, as if inhaling the city's last breath. Inside St. Dymphna's church, the bell that had once tolled 13 stood silent. Yet something else sounded in its place, a single steady heartbeat echoing through the nave. The sexton, who later swore it was real, said it came from beneath the floor. He bent to listen and felt warmth through the stone, like the pulse of something sleeping far below. At the same moment, a light flickered in every window from Whitechapel to Kensington, not firelight, something colder. Neighbours saw it and thought it lightning trapped in glass. Others said it was the city itself trying to wake. Then came the breath. It swept through London all at once, a gust without wind, rippling the fog like a wave. The horses started moving again. The lamps steadied. The heartbeat in the church faded. The people blinked, shivered, and carried on, unaware that they'd stopped at all. But the city remembered. The next day's papers didn't print the story. Instead, they ran a single, identical line in every edition. The hour between bells has passed. No one could explain who had written it. Since then, old watchmen and sleepless wanderers have spoken of that missing hour, the one unmarked by clocks. They say it still returns when the fog is thick enough, when the bells falter, when the air turns silver and the world grows too quiet. If you find yourself walking alone and notice the lamps dim all at once, if the wind stops and your footsteps leave no echo, don't move. Because you're inside it. And if you breathe too loudly, the city might remember it's not supposed to. When dawn finally came to London, it brought no light. The sun rose behind the fog, pale and thin as milk, turning every window to dull glass. The city looked washed of all its colour, brick to grey, sky to ash, even the Thames moving like liquid lead. No birds sang, no chimneys smoked. The air hung still, heavy with the scent of salt and iron, as if the sea had crept into every street during the night and left behind only silence. Those who remembered the strange hour before morning whispered that something had changed. The clocks had resumed their ticking. The bells had found their voices again, yet everything felt wrong, as though London were a photograph of itself, drained of warmth. In Limehouse, a dock worker swore that when he looked at his reflection in the river, it didn't blink when he did. In Holborn, milk curdled in the pail before it reached the doorstep. In Camden, a child pointed at the sky and asked, "Where did the blue go?" The fog wasn't gone, it had only settled lower, pressing against the ground like a shroud. It seemed to move with purpose now, curling around lampposts, slipping through keyholes, tracing the outlines of graves and doorways. By noon, a strange light began to rise from it, not gold, not silver, but something colder, the color of breath on glass. Those who dared to touch the mist said it felt like cloth, soft and warm, yet it left frost on their fingers. The scientists tried to explain it, of course. They called it an atmospheric inversion, a trick of the weather, but no weather had ever stolen color from the living before. That afternoon, the city's photographers gathered in Chancery Lane, hoping to capture the phenomenon. They loaded their plates, focused their lenses, and waited for a break in the fog. None came. When they developed their images later, each photograph showed the same thing, not streets or buildings, but faces, dozens of them, some smiling, some weeping, all blurred as if moving toward the glass. By evening, Londoners stopped speaking of it. They went about their routines, pretending the grey world was the one they'd always known, but the silence held, the fog did not lift, and the gas lights that burned at night now glowed faint blue instead of gold, as if remembering something that had happened when the city slept. In the archives of the Times there is one final entry dated November 1st, 1888, written in a trembling hand. The morning came without color, but not without consequence. No one knows who wrote it, or why the line beneath it trails off, as if interrupted mid-sentence. Even now, when London wakes to a grey dawn and the air feels too still, the old souls along the river whisper that the city never fully woke that day, that part of it stayed asleep, dreaming in monochrome. And when the fog thickens just right, you can see the world the way it did. Pale, breathless, waiting for the color to return. By the second night of November 1888, the fog had thinned enough for the stars to make a timid return, faint, trembling pinpricks in a sky still grey from memory. London exhaled, slow and uncertain, as if afraid to hear its own voice again. The city had survived the longest Halloween in its history, but it did not feel alive. Doors that had stayed locked through the storm began to open. Candles burned low in windows where no one stood to tend them. The cobblestones still glistened with moisture that would not dry, though no rain had fallen since morning. The fog was leaving, yes, but it was not empty. In Whitechapel, an old woman sweeping her step looked up to find a figure in her doorway, her husband, dead 15 years, smiling as if he'd only been out for bread. He said nothing, only tipped his cap and vanished into the street. In Clerkenwell, the night watchman of the brewery saw lights glowing behind the sealed doors, not firelight, not gaslight, but something gentler, golden white, moving through the rooms in slow procession. He swore he heard singing. In Camden, a little girl told her mother that the fog had left shadows that remember us. The mother scolded her for nonsense until she saw her own reflection in the window smile back a moment too late. Everywhere, small things shifted. Letters fell from mantelpieces that had been sealed inside drawers. A clock, long broken, chimed once at midnight. Footsteps echoed on empty staircases, steady as if practiced. And every so often, someone would open their door and smell lavender, that faint, impossible scent from another life. The city didn't scream this time, it simply listened. At the stroke of 12, the Thames began to glow. Not brightly, just a thin band of light running its surface, winding through London like a silver vein. Those who stayed awake long enough to see it claimed they saw faces in the current, serene, familiar, dissolving as the tide pulled them east. The river, they said, was taking them home. At dawn, the glow faded. The fog retreated to the banks and lingered there, coiling like a cat that had finally found its place to sleep. London looked ordinary again, filthy, busy, heartbreakingly human, but something beneath it had shifted. The air felt lighter. The silence between the bells sounded forgiven. For weeks afterward, no one spoke of the night the fog broke. It was too strange, too holy. Yet some who lived through it kept certain habits. They left one window unlatched each Halloween. They burned a single candle after midnight. They whispered thanks to the air before sleeping, because they knew the truth. The fog hadn't come to haunt them, it had come to remember them. And when it left, it took only what it had lost: the forgotten, the restless, the ones who had waited too long for someone to call their names again. By sunrise the city stirred, the bells rang clear, the streets shimmered with dew that glowed faintly blue before fading to silver. And somewhere along the river, a soft wind carried 1,000 voices westward, whispering content finally home.